Guys, I am so excited for you to meet my new boyfriend, the Australian supermodel.
Yeah, us too. It's kind of all you've been talking about.
For weeks. Well, it's not every day you get to date
An Australian supermodel.
Oh my gosh, he's here! Angus!
Whoa.
Angie! Isn't he gorgeous? Get your gorgeousness over here!
Hi, I'm Angus. I'm a chippity-top model from Australia. My hobbies include doing sit-ups and having abs for days. Do you want to see my best pose?
No, I don't think...
It's okay.
Okay, there it is.
Oh, Angie, stop! You know that pose drives me crazy!
Really?
How was work today, honey?
It was hard. Being a chippity-top model from Australia is not fun and games, you know.
I know. Ask him what he's working on.
What are you working on?
I'm in the middle of doing a photo shoot for Shin's Weekly magazine.
He has got the best shins.
Have you seen my shins? They're perfect.
Whoa.
They're like sticks.
Is that good?
Oh, shins like that don't just happen, you know. You have to put in time at the gym.
It's true. I'm there 4 to 7 hours a day, sometimes more.
When you spend 4 hours in the gym, what do you do?
Oh, my agent is always on me about looking my best. She says to me, Angie, if your shins aren't perfect, then you won't get the job. And I said, I know.
I don't really understand what you're saying.
Do you want to see my abs?
Oh, he has got abs for days. You guys, this is how he got discovered. Tell them the story. This is a great story.
I was in the pack doing sit-ups. And my agent came up to me and said, Angus, you've got abs for days. And I said, I know.
Isn't that a great story? I love that story.
Yeah.
Awesome story. On that note, you look at
Look at the time.
Yeah.
Time.
You gotta...
Oh, I'll never forget what my agent said to me before my first photo shoot. She said, Angus, don't be nervous. Don't be scared. And I said, I won't.
Angie, you know that pose drives me crazy.
Here. What?
Let's go. Look, they'll never notice we left.
I'm right behind... I'm right behind you.
Oh, Angie, you know when you do chin-ups, it drives me crazy.
I know.
So random. So right here on Disney Channel.
Today, Britain stands at a fork in its crossroads, and its people are asking questions. Now we've got our country back, what actually is it? Who are we, and why?
The best way to find out where Britain's heading is to look behind us into something called history, a sort of rear-view mirror for time. So that's where I'm going, back there.
It's a journey that'll take me the length and width of the country, from the White Cliffs of Dover to the Scottish Highlands of the Scottish Highlands, from old stone circles to modern stone circles, from the tranquil beauty of Roman Bath
To the golden wonder of Oxford services.
I'll discover how we went from ancient man to Ed Sheeran,
why Elizabeth I happened, and solving the mystery of just who Winston Churchill was and why he wound up helplessly trapped inside this banknote. Along the way, I'll be shouting at helicopters!
And looking at some of the biggest faces in British history and asking other people's faces about them.
Why did they call John Major the Prince of Onions?
And also walking somewhere impressive with my mouth shut while my voice speaks anyway, like I'm talking aloud in my own head. All of it taking place in this sceptred isle we call home. So join me, Philomena Cunk, as I take you right up the history of the United Britain of Great Kingdom.
This is Cunk on Britain.
It's hard to imagine while you're standing in it, but there was a time before Britain, before Europe, before the world, even before the universe. Nobody can say when it was, because it was also before clocks and words. It was a time when nothing existed, empty, without motion or energy or light or hope, just like Plymouth today. Just imagine something like this orange, and then imagine it's not there. Then do that one by one with everything that exists until there's nothing at all. That's what Britain was like until the Big Bang. The Big Bang created the universe in one mad explosion that was probably deafening, although luckily ears didn't exist yet. Computers think it looked like this, although eyes also didn't exist back then either, so we can't be sure. And it was so long ago now, it's probably best not to keep dredging it up. Britain was already part of Earth, but it was scrunched in along with loads of other countries in a gigantic landmass called Pangaea. At this time, Pangaea was full of dinosaurs, a race of Godzilla monsters so scary normal human beings didn't dare exist until they'd all gone. Dinosaurs came in many flavours, just like kettle chips. As this actual footage shows, the main ones were the across ones who ate grass, and the up and down ones who ate the across ones. This tyrannical sawdust Rex is the only real dinosaur left in the world, which is probably why it's so angry, spending literally every waking moment of its life roaring helplessly at passing tourists. People wonder why the dinosaurs became extinct, although it's hardly surprising they died out when you see the barbaric conditions they're kept in zoos such as this one. Underfed, starving, some of them little more than skeletons. Luckily, the dinosaurs were soon replaced by different animals like me. Evolution is complicated, so we've massively slowed it down here so you can see it happening.
And this wasn't the only change that was happening. Pangaea was changing too.
Over time, all the countries decided to split away one by one to work on solo projects, and Britain was no exception.
Stone Age man used stones to make basic weapons and tools, like these hand axes. As well as boring, these are also shit by today's standards, but back then they were cutting edge, because they had a cutting edge. The Stone Age was all rocks, wasn't it? Are stones made of rock, or are rocks made of stone?
Both. A stone is a rock. Generally, a rock is...
And a rock is a stone.
Yeah. Generally, rocks are more edgy, more ragged varieties of stone. The Stone Age lasted a very long time. In fact, our species spent more time in the Stone Age than any other. Let's think of it this way. If you look at the human history, prehistory as a year, and so New Year's Day is where humans start to use fire and shape stone tools. And this year is the last split second before midnight at the other end of the year. Then we're in the Old Stone Age until about 3 p.m. on the 31st of December.
So rocks are more jaggedy.
You could tell Stone Age stuff was precious because they kept everything deep underground.
Why did Stone Age people bury all their stuff underground? Were they worried someone might steal it?
No, that's how we find it. It wasn't always underground. It was on the top. The reason we find it as archaeologists is that we go out and we dig it up.
Oh. But not all Stone's Age things have to be dug up. Some are still visible, which means you can see them.
This is Stonehenge, early man's finest achievement. To Stone's Age Britons, this was a cross between Nemesis at Alton Towers, in that it was a spectacular attraction, and the queue for Nemesis at Alton Towers, in that it never fucking moves. Stonehenge was used to tell the time, which means Stonehenge is the only clock you can see from space, unless you have a clock in your spaceship.
Eventually, primitive cave boffins discovered new materials. Early man dropped rocks like a stone and got into metal, bronze, and then iron. Iron Man was born. But this Iron Man didn't have superpowers like the Iron Man in films. He couldn't fly or tolerate Gwyneth Paltrow, so instead he had to go to lengthy measures to defend himself. Luckily, cave boffins had also invented the iron spike, and shortly after inventing the spike, they invented stabbing each other. To make sure they stabbed the right people, Britons formed into primitive gangs called tribes, and like many gangs, they got into graffiti, vandalising the countryside with gigantic doodles. But this happy land of spikes and hill filth was about to come under threat from something nobody saw coming: Romans. Where did the Romans come from?
To begin with, they came from Rome, and then they came from the Roman Empire.
Right, but where in Britain did they come from?
Not from Britain, they came from Rome, which is in Italy.
Right, well, this is about the history of Britain, so where in Britain did they come from?
Well, the Romans came from Rome, and they headed northwards and conquered most of Europe. And then they crossed the English Channel, and they conquered about half of Britain.
And where did they go once they were in Britain?
Well, they tried to get to Scotland, but they decided it wasn't worth the effort of going there.
Yeah, I felt that. The Romans were so advanced, they came with Latin pre-installed, and they soon taught the primitive locals how to wash and walk on their hind legs. The Romans were fearsome in battle, but soon found themselves facing resistance from some British locals known as Celts. There was heavy fighting, although according to experts, it wouldn't have quite looked like this.
Celts famously would, the warriors would strip naked, paint themselves in designs, and go into battle naked. They believed that by painting themselves in designs, that they were calling out to their gods up in the sky for protection and for courage and for help.
Did the Romans have chainmail then?
They had armour of a sort.
They had armour and they were naked.
Yeah.
Who won?
Well,
the Romans.
The Romans won in the end.
I knew it. I bet when the Celts turned up naked and saw what the Romans had on, I bet they were kicking themselves. I bet they felt stupid. I bet they were like, who suggested this? Having defeated the Celts, the Romans set about revolutionising British life. They built Hard Ian's Wall and put the capital of Britain in Colchester, where nobody would want to come and get it. They introduced coins and invented these primitive 8-bit computer game graphics, but couldn't make them move. What the Romans really loved was bathing, which is why they built this in the English town of Bath. No one in Britain had seen anything as sophisticated as these baths. You could think of it as an early example of gentrification, like when someone opens an artisan bakery in Hull. Imagine in ancient Britain walking into this place. He'd scarcely be able to comprehend what he was seeing. It'd be like Steve McFadden climbing on board Concorde. Perhaps most impressive of all, the Romans invented roads. Before roads was invented, you had to travel around by standing at the edge of your village and seeing how far you could jump. Despite all this, some people resisted the Roman invasion. Queen Boudica came from Norfolk, like so many rebels. Myline Class, Ed Balls, Delia Smith. Boudica hated the Romans.
She led a barbarian army in revolt and attacked Colchester, turning it from the bustling capital into a smouldering hellhole full of weeping and despair, which you can still visit today. Rome was the most advanced warfare machine on the planet, but Boudicca's army fought back with the weapon they knew best, spikes, and lost because it's just spikes.
Once Boudicca was crushed, the Romans ruled over Britain for years.
Britain was left on its own. It had taken back control from the unelected bureaucrats of Rome and was free at last to explore its own proud destiny. And it did that by immediately entering the Dark Ages.
We don't know a huge amount about what actually happened during the Dark Ages because the Romans had taken the last pens with them. That's probably why it became a time of myth and great heroes like King Arthur. Even though he didn't exist, King Arthur lived in a castle called Camelot, where he founded the Round Table, even though he didn't do that either. The Round Table was a sort of lazy Susan, which meant the knights could get at the snacks they wanted without having to move around in their armour.
But perhaps the greatest British icon to emerge during the Dark Ages was mega patriot and dragon slayer, St. George.
We don't know where or when George slayed the dragon, but we know it definitely happened because a bystander took this painting of the event. And it probably happened somewhere in Wales. It's one of the few concrete facts to come out of the Dark Ages. Do we know for certain the dragon was threatening St. George? Or do we just jump to conclusions because of the way the dragon looked?
The story of St. George killing the dragon isn't actually true because there are no dragons.
After he killed the dragon, how was he rewarded? I mean, what's better than a saint?
Well, he didn't kill the dragon because dragons don't exist. It's made up.
But is it true to say he was the greatest Englishman who ever lived?
The thing about St. George is that he wasn't actually English. His father came from the middle of what's now Turkey, and his mother came from Palestine, and he never actually came to England.
Oh, you're joking. But although St. George never bothered, lots of other foreigners did set foot in Britain, as it got invaded again and again. First by the Angles and the Saxons, and then by the notoriously brutal Vikings, who arrived from Denmark in longboats, wearing metal helmets which they'd somehow managed to pull over the terrifying skull horns that jutted from their heads.
British King Alfred of Great fought the Vikings by giving up and letting them settle in York, probably because it had the Jorvik Viking Centre. Soon interbreeding meant the Vikings lost their distinctive horns and became indistinguishable from normal humans.
For a few hundred years, Britain was relatively peaceful, until one day when a new king, Harold, was getting coronated, and Halley's Comet, a sort of very short firework display, appeared in the sky. The comet has always heralded great events. It last appeared in our skies in 1986, the same year the sitcom Brushstrokes started.
Because of you, these things I do. Because of you. Because of you. Oh.
In King Harold's day, the comet was also a sign of terrible things to come. The year was 1066.
1066 and the Battle of Hastings are probably British history's two most famous events, so it's handy they happened the same year.
Harold had a rival. In the first example of an EU national coming over here to take British jobs, a Frenchman called William set sail to seize the throne and become king.
It's amazing to think that only 1,000 years ago this field was interesting, because it was here that Harold and William's armies met. There have been many battles in Britain's history, but we don't know what happened in most of them. The Battle of Hastings is different. We've got an accurate visual record of the whole thing, thanks to a quick-thinking bystander who took a tapestry of it. Despite looking like a Game of Thrones season finale drawn by an 8-year-old boy, the Baywatch tapestry captures the full force of the battle. It's just like being there, but in wool. Here's the Norman archers, steaming in on their blue horses. Here's a sort of stick fight bit, some chopped up people down here. His head's off. They'll be furious about that. Some goose monsters in the sky looking down. Some sort of lion thing up here, eating its own tail. Is that its bumhole? I think that's its bumhole. As you can see, Harold won when he triumphantly caught an arrow in his eye. Sadly, it wasn't enough, and he died soon after. No one knows why. This meant that the Normans were victorious. At last, William the Conqueror's name made sense. William winning was like Brexit backwards. Britain was suddenly part of Europe, and that meant everything had to change. There were new castles, new cathedrals, even the Tower of London, and amazingly, all built by one man, Norman architecture. The new king wanted a list of everybody in the country, where they lived and what stuff they had. It became known as the Domesday Book and was very much the internet of its day. So is this the actual Domesday Book?
This is the actual Domesday Book, yes.
And it's usually under glass, isn't it, this book?
Well, usually it's not accessible at all, so it's very rarely on display. So this is really quite a special occasion that we've got it out for you to be able to see it today.
So you're not allowed to touch it?
No.
I thought that was because of the curse.
The curse?
Yeah, I heard that there was a curse on it.
I've definitely not heard that, so I don't think there's a curse.
I thought it was going to be like, you know, Raiders of the Lost Ark, where that Nazi gets his face melted off.
Yeah.
I thought it was going to be like that.
I'm afraid not.
Oh. So how does the Domesday Book compare to a book like The Runaway by Martina Cole?
Well, I've not read The Runaway by Martina Cole, but
It's
I think...
really good.
OK, I think that's a work of fiction, so it's a made-up story, whereas Domesday is recording the land and landholding in England before the Norman Conquest and after the Norman Conquest. It kind of lists who holds land and what's within that land and how much it's worth, and it does that in a lot of detail. So Roger holds a land here it's just called Milderhope. It's probably going to have a different name now.
So how can we free the people living in this book?
Well, they don't live in the book.
But their souls are inside the book.
I don't think that's necessarily true. I think this records information about them, but they're not in there. It's just, it's just a record about them. It doesn't sort of contain their being or anything like that. We don't need to worry about them.
Are you sure?
I'm sure.
The book gives us a unique insight into what life would have been like in the Middle Ages. In the medieval times, if you were lucky enough to be a king, or a knight, or a lady with a pointy hat with all nets on it, you might have lived somewhere like this. A castle. Castles were originally built by kings to protect their land and to sit in, whereas today they're mainly used as extortionate wedding venues. Of course, not everyone was a king. Everyone else was peasants. Peasants lived in thatched wooden huts full of chicken shit. The water was filthy, so everyone drank beer, and the only thing to eat was bread. It was a particularly challenging time for the gluten intolerant, but luckily nobody was yet middle class, so they just put up with it. But life for the common man was about to get better, thanks to the Magna Carta, a sort of terms and conditions notice King John had to sign against his will, which limited his powers and gave citizens basic rights. The Magna Carta kick-started the whole of British political history, a history so complex, even experts can no longer keep track of it. What's the most political thing that's ever happened in Britain?
I'm not sure. I think. Gosh, that's a tricky question in the sense that there are definitely degrees of. Gosh, what's the most political? So there are lots of things that are straightforwardly political, and then there are other things that are not. They're sort of halfway, I guess. But I genuinely can't identify the most political.
Second most. Meanwhile, back in history, by the Middle Ages, medieval England was such a big deal. It was even happening in Scotland. The Scots have always been a proud, confident nation, ready to complain if they think they've not been given their own little section in a landmark history programme. But in 1296, Scotland was reluctantly under the rule of English Edward I. One man wanted out, William Willis. No one knew what William Willis looked like until 1995, when Hollywood scientists discovered he looked exactly like Mel Gibson, who was coincidentally playing a Scottish Apache in a film called Braveheart, a sort of Scottish reboot of Dancing with Wolves.
That they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom!
Sensitively informing modern audiences about a story little known outside Scotland, the film emotively and expertly depicted William as he gathered a band of noble warriors and defeated the English army at Stirling Bridge using face paint and extreme whittling.
To this day, the words Stirling Bridge conjure pride in every Scotsman's heart, while to an Englishman those same words conjure up literally no feelings at all. But his glory days weren't to last, and Willis and his men were defeated by the English at Falkirk. With Willis gone, a posh Scotsman called Robert E. Bruce thrashed the English at the Battle of Bannockburn and took the throne. Scotland would never again be under English control, for a bit. Willis, meanwhile, was eventually captured by the English and taken to London, where he was publicly hung, drawn and quartered. This means he was hung by his neck, then while he was still alive, his guts were chopped out and his body cut into 4 quarters. Something you can ask your local butcher to do to a chicken.
Once it had stopped screaming, Willis's severed head was placed atop a pike on London Bridge, like a sort of gory Scottish Pez. Willis's execution kicked off a golden age of public entertainment. As well as watching people die painfully, popular pastimes included bear baiting, shin kicking. But British culture wasn't just being cruel to animals, it was also bum jokes. And the William Shakespeare of bum jokes was Geoffrey Chaucer.
His greatest work was the Canterbury Tales, which everyone has pretended to have read at least some of.
His stories feature lots of bawdy shenanigans, but it wasn't all chuckles in the Middle Ages. In 1348, Britain was invaded again, but this time by a plague. Not a metaphorical plague like a metaphorical plague, but an actual plague, made of plague. The Black Death symptoms were disgusting. Discoloured buboes grew in the groin and armpits.
Infection.
How long would you get off work if you got the Black Death?
In about 70% of cases, you'd be off work forever.
Oh, right. Result?
Because you'd be dead.
Oh. Roughly half the population died, which statistically meant that if you wanted to save your loved ones, you'd have to die yourself. The Middle Ages started like a fancy dress party and ended like Halloween. But once it had got its strength back and grown some more people, England descended into 30 glorious years of violent conflict between rival royal houses. The War of the Roses, which sounds like a sitcom about florists, but perhaps surprisingly wasn't. This was an incredibly complex period of history, which is frustrating because we've got to get it out of the way in this episode, and we spent too long talking about Mel Gibson earlier. The War of the Roses is a complicated struggle, but could you sum it up for my viewers in like 3 words?
Conspiracy, dynasty, war.
Could you do it a bit more thoroughly than that? I'll give you 10 seconds. Start.
It's a struggle to control England and the crown.
I've got a few more seconds.
Between warring
dynasties. Perhaps the most violent event of the War of the Roses was the Battle of Bosworth, which Richard III tried to escape by burrowing under a car park. He hid down there for centuries before finally emerging in 2013, by which point the war was over and he died of tarmac inhalation. Richard III may have died, but he gave birth to a series of celebrity kings and queens, the Tudors, very much the Kardashians of British history. This is Hampton Court Palace, a building so impressive it has to be accompanied by harpsichord music.
These days, Hampton Court is open 10 till 4:30 in the winter, 10 till 6 in the summer, with last entry to the maze 45 minutes before closing. Prices start at £18.40 per adult and £9.20 per child. A family ticket will set you back at least £32.30. Unless you're buying that ticket in the 15th century, and your family name is Tudor. But what do we mean by the word Tudor? Let's ask an expert. What do we mean by the word Tudor?
The word Tudor is quite controversial because the Tudors at the time didn't call themselves Tudor. Tudor is the family name, the Welsh family name of the ancestors on the father's side of King Henry VII. But the only person who calls Henry VII Henry Tudor is Richard III when he's trying to stop him becoming king. And he uses the name Tudor just to mean this is some random Welsh person rather than an appropriate person to replace me as king. So the Tudors don't use the name Tudor very much at all. Some people refer to it as being their family name later on.
Sorry, I had that thing, you know, where your brain stops listening. If the Tudors were the Kardashians of their time, this was their Kim. Henry VIII, the kingiest king who ever kinged over Britain. If you had to draw a king, you'd definitely draw him, although maybe not as well as this, unless you're a 16th century portrait artist. But what was so great about Henry VIII? Why is he the king we all still remember, unlike, say, Richard V? Well, for one thing, he was fat, so he takes up more room in the memory. But Henry's also memorable for his chronic wife addiction. He had 6 wives, all called Catherine. He was a Catherineaholic, or Catholic for short. He got through so many Catherines, he actually got bored of killing them and had to invent a new way of getting rid of them, called divorce. The Pope hated divorce, so Henry decided to divorce him. He took back control, broke with Europe, and made up a new religion, which it turns out is easier to do than popes like to pretend. Henry created the Church of England, didn't he? Did he have to find a British pope?
He didn't need to find a British pope. You could just have bishops. You can just use the bishops and people that you've got in there already.
If you had to find a British pope now, who would you go for?
You couldn't use the Archbishop of Canterbury.
No, you have to have someone else.
Someone from without the church.
Yeah, like Matt Baker of The One Show.
So you're Matt Baker off The One Show.
He's not an obvious choice, you see. That's why I think he'd be good. But the more you think about it, the more it makes sense. Henry VIII kept having a go on new wives because he wanted a boy to pop out of one of them, and eventually one did, called Edward. When Henry died, Edward became king, aged just 9 years old. Edward died aged 15, the youngest anyone had ever died of old age. He was followed as king by Lady Jane Grey. She ruled for 9 glorious days, almost a week. These were among the fastest royals we've ever had. After Jane came this woman, Queen Mary. And there really was something about Mary, but not something funny like Cameron Diaz with all dried spunk in her hair. Mary's something was religious intolerance. She had so many Protestants burnt at the stake, she became known as Bloody Mary, because like the drink, she was horrible. The next queen was Queen Elizabeth, who in the first of many such coincidences appeared just in time for the Elizabethan era. Queen Elizabeth I got a crown screwed on here in Westminster Abbey. Elizabeth I was a new sort of king in that she was a queen, which meant she got paid less and sat on horses sideways. To stop persecution, Elizabeth allowed her subjects to practice whatever religion they liked, as long as they pretended to be Church of England when asked, like middle-class people do when they want their kids to go to a posh school. During Elizabeth's reign, British culture flourished, especially the world of theatre, which is sadly still with us to this day. The greatest playwright of the age was Will.I.am Shakespeare. It's often said if Shakespeare were alive today, he'd be sending his scripts to television and film companies. It wouldn't make them because they were so long and boring. But while audiences thrilled to the tedious drama of Shakespeare's terrible plays, some pioneering Britons were experiencing real drama by going out exploring. It was now the British got really into boats, by getting into boats. Sailors of the time were like spacemen, but on water, exploring the unknown armed only with an engineless wooden car called a boat, and a sort of basic paper sat-nav called a map, which had hardly anything on it, because hardly anything had been found yet. On maps of the sea,
Did they show the hills? You know, the little moving hills with the white bit on top?
The waves?
Is that what they call the moving hills with the white bits on top?
I think that's what you mean.
Did an explorer ever try to sail into the sky? You know, find a bit of sea that's sort of going up and...
No.
Despite the difficulty, Queen Elizabeth sent a load of sailors over the sea to nick treasure off the Spanish. The first British explorer to do this was Sir Walter Raleigh. Sir Walter Raleigh was a great sailor, wasn't he? So why is it today we only remember him for his bikes?
Well, there might have been a connection between that branch of the Raleigh family and the later bike manufacturer, but I very much doubt it. People weren't using cycles of any kind in Sir Walter Raleigh's days.
Oh, really?
I think we really have to accept that Sir Walter Raleigh was just an expert sailor.
How did Sir Walter Raleigh invent the potato?
Well, he didn't invent the potato in that I don't think anyone actually has ever invented a root vegetable, because they're obviously being cultivated and used by people living in the Americas when he arrived there.
When Sir Walter Raleigh first saw potatoes, was he scared of them?
I think that when Sir Walter Raleigh first saw potatoes, not that we've any documented records on the moment when he first beheld a potato or a field of potatoes, but I don't think he was scared of them. This is a buccaneering character, and I think that he probably was able to take on and manage his emotions whilst engaging with potatoes at first sight.
We still celebrate potatoes to this day by buying and eating them. It's amazing to think that Queen Elizabeth was the first British monarch to be impressed by a baked potato, and the last. Walter Raleigh was big news, but he wasn't quite as big news as Sir Francis Drake. This is Drake's ship, the Golden Hind, which is Tudor for horse of gold. It was in this ship Drake became the first person to circumcise the globe, which is probably why this sort of ship is called a clipper. Imagine being on deck in that perilous age. You're in the middle of the ocean, a mighty thunderstorm's brewing. There's a sailor over there, another one over there, the king's sailor turning the steering wheel thing, potatoes and spare wooden legs rolling around the deck, a seagull up that pole thing, someone reading a treasure map through a telescope, a bloke with a white beard carrying a tray of fish fingers, pirates all laughing in that horrible throaty way that they do, and at any moment the prospect that you might just sail off the edge of the world. It's a sobering thought, which they'd have needed because they were all pissed to the bollocks on rum. The British's mastery of the oceans made Catholic King Philip of Spain furious in Spanish. So he sent his secret weapon to attack England, a woman called Spanish Amanda. The story goes that Drake was playing a leisurely game of bowls on Plymouth Hall when the Spanish attacked. England was victorious. Meanwhile, in Scotland, there was another Mary on the scene, Mary Queen of Scots. Mary and Elizabeth were rivals for the throne. Catholics loved Mary because they go mad for anyone called Mary. So Elizabeth cut her head off, which made it harder for Mary to take the throne because she could no longer see where it was. Elizabeth had ended the rivalry. The final score was 1-0. Elizabeth died without ever marrying, so has gone down in history as the vegan queen. She left no heirs, which was the olden word for children, making her the season finale of the Tudors. The next top royal was King James, who luckily hadn't inherited his mum's missing head, and so could become King of Scotland and England at the same time. King James I of England was also King James VI of Scotland, wasn't he?
He was.
Was he also the other 5 King Jameses in between?
No, but he was rather conscious of those other 5 Jameses.
Do you think he ever forgot which James he was?
No, I'm pretty sure that he knew there'd been all 5 before him and they'd had rotten lives.
Oh.
The first had been murdered by his subjects, the second killed by an exploding cannon. The third was murdered by his subjects after losing a battle. The fourth was killed in battle. And the fifth died of nervous exhaustion after losing a battle.
So is it just bad luck being called James then, do you think?
No, the Stuarts are an astonishingly accident-prone family.
King James brought England, Scotland and Wales together, didn't he?
King James brought England, Scotland, Wales, Cornwall and Ireland together.
So he brought all those together,
That's right.
like Simon Cowell when he brought together One Direction.
Yes, except it lasted a bit longer.
Which is your favourite?
Of the kingdoms.
No, of One Direction.
I don't have one.
Yeah, very wise.
Thanks to King James, Great Britain was born, and with it came a new flag, the Union Jack, a sort of mega mix of the nation's previous flags. The Union Jack has it all. The white and red of England, the blue of Scotland, and from Wales, red again, from the dragon. But not the actual dragon, even though it's the best bit of the flag. Basically, whoever was doing this probably just had a ruler and couldn't face doing the dragon. King James was Protestant and knew that Catholics wanted to kill him, so he had all his clothes padded in case he was stabbed. Unfortunately, he didn't have the Houses of Parliament padded, and that's where the Catholics chose to attack, using explosions. This photo from the time shows the gunpowder plotters in the hats and false beards they used to hide their identities. What they didn't know is that someone had written their names on the wall behind, which is why they all got caught. But one man was about to cause even more explosive changes to Britain, Oliver Cromwell. Some of Cromwell's fellow Puritans had sailed away from Britain's shores, hoping to forge a new life of Spartan misery in the newfound land of America. But Cromwell stayed behind to fall out with King Charles I. He wanted Parliament dissolved, but nobody could find a glass big enough, so they decided to have a civil war instead.
They called it a civil war because there was a swear jar and people apologised after killing each other, like in tennis. The Civil War was a clash of styles. The King's Cavaliers had panache and weird outfits, while Cromwell's Roundheads were basic, brutish little bulldog men. It was like a fight between Wayne Rooney and Noel Fielding, but not as funny.
Eventually, after many reenactments just like this, the Roundheads won 1-0. Charles was caught in a big king net and executed here in Whitehall. A proud man to the last, he wore 2 shirts so no one could see him shiver, to preserve his regal dignity. And according to witnesses, it worked. His severed head rolled regally along the ground, pumping blood everywhere and getting covered in hay and dirt and dried up flecks of dignified fox shit. And no one mentioned the rest of him shivering at all. Under Cromwell, Britain became less fun than ever before, including when it was just rocks. As a Puritan, Cromwell outlawed popular entertainment, effectively turning the entire country into BBC 4. Little wonder that after Cromwell died, everyone decided it would be fun having a king once more. Charles II came down from the tree he'd been hiding in, and everyone was happy again, until suddenly in 1665 the plague happened. Again. Why did they decide to have the plague twice? More than anything, it must have just been boring.
Well, they had many, many more times than twice.
Did we get the plague because of the European free movement of rats and fleas and our inability to control our borders?
It certainly looks as though the epidemic came to England by ship.
Mm.
So in that sense, yes, it's imported. They are immigrant rats and fleas.
And they wouldn't integrate, except when they bit us. The Great Plague of London finally petered out in 1666, just in time for the Great Fire of London, which started here, in Pudding Lane. It was a hot, dry summer when a thatched wooden bakery full of highly combustible flour and flaming ovens inexplicably caught fire for some reason. How hot was the Great Fire of London? Could you, stand in somewhere like Maidenhead and sort of warm your hands on it like that?
You couldn't warm your hands, but you probably could see it.
How many other cities did the Great Fire of London burn down?
No other cities. It was the Great Fire of London, but lots of other places were affected.
But how do we know no other cities burnt down? Because it would have burnt them down.
Yes, but we know that London was burnt, even though it was burnt down. So we would have the same sorts of information about other places that didn't burn down.
But there might have been another place burnt down that just burnt down completely, and now we don't know because it's not there because it was burnt down.
But then that wouldn't be part of the Great Fire of London, would it?
No, it'd be outside, wouldn't it?
Yes.
So were there any others that burnt down?
There don't seem to have been any other fires at the same time.
Although we don't know because they burnt down.
Well, that's one way of looking at it.
We know a lot about the plague and the fire of London from the diaries of this man, Samuel Pepys. Samuel Pepys is probably the most famous diarist in the world, apart from Anne Frank, but no one knows what happened to her. We do know what happened to Pepys because he put it in his diary. Pepys was brave, wasn't he, writing his diary at the time of the Great Fire of London. You know, all that paper. He risked his life for us, really, didn't he?
I don't think he risked his life for us. It was for himself.
If Pepys was alive today, do you think he'd be doing Snapchat? And it's best to say yes, because we're trying to attract younger viewers.
Yes, I'm sure he would be.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes.
Yeah. After the fire was blown out by the King, London was extensively rebuilt by Sir Christopher Wren, the most significant bird in British history since Francis Drake.
This is his finest achievement, St Paul's Cathedral, built on a site of spiritual significance near the Sainsbury's local and the restaurant where they do first dates.
As well as being big, the cathedral was the first building in the world with a hat. It would get 10 out of 10 in Cathedral Review Monthly, if that magazine existed, which it doesn't. Meanwhile, London wasn't the only thing that was being burned. Witches were too. People genuinely believed witches were amongst them, their fear fueled by leaked photos like this. There wasn't a clear-cut way of telling whether someone was a witch if they weren't wearing their pointy hat. So Britain appointed its first and only Witchfinder General. Who was the Witchfinder General?
The Witchfinder General was a young man called Matthew Hopkins.
Matthew Hopkins? He went to my school.
This is a different Matthew Hopkins, I hope.
How do you know? He's an IT consultant now.
Well, the Matthew Hopkins I'm talking about died 350 years ago. He went on a witch hunt which covered the whole of East Anglia and resulted in the death of about 100 women.
Yeah, it's not the same Matthew Hopkins.
No.
My Matthew Hopkins is going through a divorce.
Well, I think that's pretty harrowing, but compared with stringing up aged women upon scaffolds and torturing them into confession, it's probably fairly minor.
Yeah, puts everything in perspective, doesn't it?
That's the great thing about history.
Mm. Matthew Hopkins devised a method to test if a woman was a witch. Hopkins' method was absolutely foolproof, which was handy because it had to be done by village idiots. The accused woman was lowered into water. If they floated, they were a witch and were killed. If they drowned, they were innocent and could go on living a normal life, underwater for 2 to 3 seconds. But the irrational world of witches and wizards was about to be blown away by the rational world of science and geniuses like Sir Isaac Newton. In 1665, Newton ran away from London because the plague was after him, so he came here, to Woolsthorpe Manor in Lincolnshire, a National Trust property that he was allowed to live in because he was famous. The story goes that an apple fell from this tree and landed on Newton's head. Despite his amazing hair, the force of the fruity blow caused several of his brain cells to rub together. And just like that, he invented gravity. What was the world like before Isaac Newton discovered gravity? Was everything just floating up to the sky?
Well, gravity was always there. So it
But
just
he just took the credit for it.
Because he had come up with laws of motion and things like that, gravity was a major part of his understanding of the world.
If gravity's real, as you seem to be claiming, how come it doesn't work on kites?
In all things, there's a balance of forces. And so a kite stays in the air because of forces that are keeping the kite in the air.
Would you say the best example of gravity today is the game show Tipping Point? Because without gravity, that wouldn't work, would it?
For sure. But I wouldn't say it's the best example of gravity. There's way more exciting examples than that.
Go on, tell me.
Well, there's flight, and there's walking on the moon. There
I
is
thought you
less
meant what's the best game show version of gravity?
Oh.
Deal or no deal?
It doesn't really use gravity.
Well, I thought you said everything uses gravity. Because Noel Edmonds would be up in the roof otherwise, wouldn't he?
That's true. We're all subject to gravity without realising it, but the game would still go on, even without gravity. Or maybe not, actually.
I've thrown you now, haven't I?
You have.
Made you think.
But gravity had a dark side. While everyone in Britain was busy thinking about why things fall, across the Atlantic, an entire nation was about to tumble, just like an apple, onto Britain's head. On the 4th of July 1776, America officially declared a war of independence from the British. It was a brutal conflict, with the British eventually suffering a humiliating defeat a mere 210 years before the premiere of the BBC sitcom Brushstrokes.
Because of you, these things I do. Because of you. Because of you. Oh.
Vice Admiral Viscount Lord Horatio Nelson. What was Lord Nelson all about? Why did his parents call him Horatio?
I think they probably intended it to be pronounced Horatio.
But it just got mishmashed up and became Horatio.
No, I think that most people still know him as Horatio Nelson.
As well as being a sailor, Nelson found time to star in lots of old paintings, doing his weird signature pose. Why did Nelson always have one hand up his jumper? What was he doing up there?
He'd lost most of his right arm, so it wasn't really trying to conceal his hand, he was actually missing an arm.
Oh, God. How do we know that that's true, though? Because, you know, Rod Hull, he used to have his arm round an emu, didn't he? It might have just been that. He didn't have it blown off at all. He was just trying to make his story more interesting.
Well, I don't see why I bothered to do that. I mean, he's already a heroic figure, so I don't think he needed to sort of feign, you know, serious injury to, if you like, deepen his growing legend. So I think we can probably say that, unlike some things, this is true.
Yeah, and the eye was true.
The eye was true as well, yes, he wore a patch.
So he was like a pirate, but like a boring one. Not being able to clap wasn't the most annoying thing in Nelson's life. He had an arch enemy, the annoyingly similar French pirate, Napoleon Cumberbatch. The fearsome French emperor had conquered most of Europe and was on the verge of having a conquer at Britain. But before he could, he had to have a Battle of Trafalgar against Nelson. The Battle of Trafalgar was one of the most famous water fights in British history, and it took place, of course, here in Trafalgar Square. It's amazing to think that back then, all this would have been underwater. Only the top of the column would have been visible. On this side, Nelson's English ships. On this side, by the Pret-a-Manger, the French fleet. And overseeing it all was Nelson, stranded on top of his stone stick, where he remains to this day. If Nelson was such a hero, why did we banish him up that big pole?
It's not a banishment, this was a national celebration. So this was very much, if you like, a symbol of British victory and pride and honouring of the man who had been so intimately associated with delivering victory at Trafalgar.
He's so high up, isn't he? He's sort of out of eyeshot. And he's getting shat on by birds.
Yeah, I mean, it's a...
Couldn't we have had him a little bit lower so that we can have a look at him?
Well, it's a fair point, I mean...
It's just like a joke.
Yeah,